Explaining the Development Gap, a policy analysis of historical, political, and economic divergence between Latin America and the United States. The persistent and profound economic development gap between the United States and Latin America represents a critical, enduring challenge in hemispheric relations. Though income levels were similar at the time of independence in the early 19th century, their developmental paths diverged drastically over the subsequent 2 centuries. This disparity is now reflected not only in economic metrics, but also in governance quality, institutional strength, and social inclusion. This analysis argues that this divergence is not a product of simple geography or culture, but stems from a complex, mutually reinforcing interplay of 3 core factors: distinct colonial institutional legacies, chronic political instability, and deep social inequality. These elements, established at critical junctures, created path-dependent trajectories that policy choices often exacerbated rather than mitigated. The root of the divergence lies in the fundamentally different colonial projects. Spanish and Portuguese colonization focused on extractive enterprises, centered on valuable resources and coercive labor regimes like the encomienda and mita, leading to societies of extreme inequality. This model entrenched institutional frameworks that protected the privileges of a tiny European elite while leaving the property rights of the masses insecure. In stark contrast, British North American colonization, facing lower indigenous population density, was oriented toward European settlement. This fostered institutions protecting the property rights of a broad cross-section of settlers and encouraged the growth of a large class of smallholding farmers. This foundation included robust traditions of local self-government, providing continuity after independence. The transition to independence solidified the divergence. The U.S. transition was achieved without a fundamental institutional break, enabling the rapid establishment of a constitutional framework. Conversely, the collapse of centralized Spanish administration left an institutional vacuum in Latin America. Newly independent nations descended into decades of chronic political instability as rival factions fought for power, causing the region's economy to stagnate and regress. This post-independence turmoil was economically immense. Between 1850 and 1900, the per capita GDP of the 6 largest Latin American economies plummeted from 51% to just 27% of the U.S. level. The region's defective institutions, instability, and deep social inequalities were deeply set, preventing it from closing the gap even during periods of subsequent export-led growth. 20th century policy choices served to widen the gap. Latin American nations adopted import substitution industrialization, ISI, often implementing an exaggeration of the model. High tariffs created inefficient domestic firms and neglected the export sector, standing in sharp contrast to the globally competitive approach of the East Asian tigers. Policy weaknesses were exposed by the oil shocks of the 1970s. Many authoritarian regimes chose to accumulate massive foreign debt rather than implementing difficult structural adjustments, prioritizing short-term consumption over fiscal health. This decision resulted in the catastrophic debt crisis and the ensuing lost decade of the 1980s, which erased prior gains and caused the gap with the U.S. to widen once again. The first core factor is the primacy of defective institutions and a weak rule of law. The persistence of insecure property rights and an ineffective judiciary, rooted in the extractive colonial system, systematically discouraged productive investment. This institutional failure is exemplified by the broken fiscal contract, where distrust and tax evasion perpetuate a state that is large in scope but weak in its capacity to enforce rules or deliver essential public goods. The second factor is chronic political instability and the failure to mediate conflict. Between 1950 and 1990, Latin America accounted for 45% of all global regime changes. This high frequency of coups and interrupted terms imposed severe economic costs through profound policy uncertainty. This pattern stems from the inability of political systems to manage the intense distributional conflicts fueled by the region's inequality. The third, arguably ultimate factor, is the vicious cycle of profound social inequality. Extreme inequality in land, wealth, and income dating back to the colonial period is the primary driver of the high-stakes, zero-sum politics that has polarized the region. Furthermore, this inequality has led to persistent underinvestment in human capital, education and health, hampering productivity growth, and perpetuating intergenerational poverty. The analysis implies that simple policy fixes or market liberalization alone are insufficient. A strategic approach to convergence requires a generational commitment focused on the fundamental drivers. This includes strengthening the rule of law through judicial reform and fostering fiscal citizenship, investing in human capital to rigorously address educational outcomes, and building resilient political institutions that encourage broad-based consensus building to successfully mediate social conflict.